Burris, and I'm the Dean of the Cameron School of Business. And I just have one comment before we begin our Q&A session. First, I didn't really appreciate the gasp about how old 57 seemed from some of you out there. That was kind of hard to handle. Dr. Ritchie and I looked at each other and thought that's not really that old, actually. But, and then my second question my first question is to Ben Shoesmith. And Ben, I realize you're a UNCW alum, and I just wondered who your favorite professor was at UNCW.
Dr. Burris, Dean Burris now, you lay it on thick.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I can answer that if you like.
Sure, yeah.
You might not like the answer.
Maybe you should elaborate on it.
All right. I had a lot of great professors. I'll throw out a couple names that made a huge impact on my life and career choices. Dr. Treem, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Simpson all did things at different points that actually pointed me toward economics, which is great. But I actually liked you a lot.
There you go. There you go.
No, last thing. You didn't just pay attention inside the classroom. I remember you took Chris Klein and myself over to your house for dinner with your family one night, and then we met in the mornings before classes just to talk about life, no economics. And that was a standout piece of my time here.
I didn't plant that, by the way. First, to let you know have these little placards in the middle of your table, and if you notice, if you would like to ask our panelists a question, there is a text number there that you can send a question, to this text number, and I believe it'll get relayed up to. This is not my personal cell number. Okay, so by the way, but it'll get relayed back to me, and then we can see whether we have, with time remaining, whether we can ask that question. So, in all seriousness, I'm just going to note before we get kicked off here that it seemed like to me that with the National Economy Report and the Global Economy Report and the comments by our regional economists, that and I know that you don't want to put your aviator jacket on that says, soft landing on the back yet, but it really seemed to me as I was looking at all the data and listening to the comments that we are approaching a soft landing, albeit you can have some external shocks that can stir that up. So I'm just gonna make that comment and ask you, do you have a response to what I just said?
Sure. I think we're all way overweighted on the notion that there's some finish line, and when we get there, we will have won. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the way the economy works. I mean, there's a cycle. Things go up, things go down. It's bumpy, and so I don't think you could have a better set of results where we are right now, with unemployment at 4.2% and headline inflation at 2.2% and GDP growing at 3% a year. So have we won, or are we going to have to play the game again? I just don't think it's a good question to ask. I go toward, we have to keep this thing going for the long term. The health of this economy is extremely strong over the long term. We've got to think about those things, and we will have bumps along the way. That's just how the economy works.
Okay. Ben, would you like to comment?
Sure. There are very few pockets of weakness right now. We do see the downward trend in inflation, so disinflation taking place in most countries. Growth is still fairly strong across the board, again, with pockets of weakness. And so I'd echo Tom's remark that it's not the finish line. There's no such thing, sure. Especially when you consider the pain that is felt in different countries and regions. There's no way that everybody in the world will say, yes, we've reached a soft landing. This is fantastic, all at the same moment. And so it's a moving target. But on the whole, I feel like if you go back to the pandemic and then to inflation in the United States in particular and in other countries that hit 7 or 9% depending on the measure that you're looking at, being in this position seems extremely unlikely. And so it's not a win, but we're definitely headed in a solid direction.
Dr. Guettabi.
Yeah, I think we're in a slightly different position in that, as I mentioned, I think we were winners of the pandemic pressures because a lot of money flowed here, but I think that there is no, at least as far as I can see, there is no correction in sight, right? And so we're normalizing, right? And so markets are healing. We're reverting to those pre-pandemic growth rates as, you know, the consumer pulls back a little bit. But I think that the economy is really healthy. It's gotten richer, and the demographics of the residents have shifted. And so I think that we've absorbed the pandemic shocks as well as probably any region, right? And so, and we're not, quote unquote, paying for it right now. We're just kind of sliding back into pre-pandemic growth rates. So again, obviously not declaring victory or anything, but I think it's quasi-smooth sailing going forward as far as I can see.
Okay, thanks. We've got a question from table 2, and that would be Natalie English.
Thank you, Dean Burris. Clearly, either I didn't have as good of economics professors in college, or I've simply matured in the last more years. But so thank you, guys. This has been fascinating for me. I have 2 questions, and Rob Kaiser gave me permission to ask both. So the first question is for the entire panel, and it has to do with the current longshoreman union negotiations, but other industries as well that are not only negotiating for better pay and benefits, but also that their jobs be saved from future automation. What does that mean, and how can that possibly work with the shrinking labor participation rates that we know are coming? And then what can businesses do to somehow alleviate the fears, keep those employees engaged? I don't know if you have any suggestions there. I'll give you a second to think about that. Mouhcine, my second question is for you. I was looking at the average household income for our region, the 3 counties, and recognizing that New Hanover Counties is the lowest. So my assumption there is that's because we have the highest population numbers living in poverty. So I'm wondering if there are other reasons for that we should be aware of.
Do you want me to start with the second one?
Yeah, let's start with the second one.
New Hanover County's average household income is not lower than Brunswick's. It's that the in-migrants who are moving in don't make as much as their, so average household income in New Hanover based on IRS migration data is actually $97,000. It's higher. It's the people who are moving in who are making less than the residents, which means potentially we're importing individuals into lower wage occupations. One of the things I didn't touch on, which kind of touches on the poverty question, is that 44% of New Hanover County residents are paying more than 35% of their income towards rent, right? And so they're considered rent burden, right? And so, but again, I'm an economist, I have 2 hands. We have experienced wage increases over the last 4 years that have outstripped rent increases, even though they were at 31%. That doesn't directly answer the question, but that's a little bit of perspective.
I'm going back to question number 1.
I'm happy to. I mean, so let me talk about labor more broadly, which is, you know, if you reflect on the 30 years before the pandemic, what happened is this country was long labor. We had increased participation, women more fully participating in the workforce, immigration, demographics, the baby boom. And in that context, the power of labor unions decreased significantly. And so most labor contracts 5 or 10 years ago felt pretty concessionary, you know, in the big picture. By the way, inflation was low, and so trying to get wage was difficult. Well, so what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years? 2 big things. One is a big bout of inflation, which hopefully we're past. And second, a real sign that the demographic boom is going to turn into a demographic bust. And so we're going to be short workers rather than long workers. Those are 2 pretty fundamental things. If you're a labor union leader in this environment, the first thing you say is, boy, I was in this 5-year contract and everyone else got pay increases and we didn't. So one piece you've got is just catch up, wage increases. And I think that's happening, and that's not irrational. I mean, there ought to be some, it used to be the auto workers just got a big contract. Boeing's on strike. You've obviously got the ports on strike as well. The second thing that happened is 2 years ago, in the context of everybody being short workers, there were big investments made everywhere in automation. And you hear about AI, you know, and that's a big thing perhaps, but just good old-fashioned basic automation, if you didn't have workers, you had to think differently about your business. And so a lot of that's coming online now, and perhaps that's part of why we're seeing high productivity, low hiring in this context. And so you do see a lot of worker groups focused on their jobs, even though the big picture might be that we're going to be short workers, not long. In any particular industry, so the actors, and the writers, they had a big strike about AI. That's part of this. I think both of those are very understandable. And, this is a negotiation. It'll get worked out however it gets worked out. But I will say, if you come back to the big picture of the U.S. economy, the demographics are going the wrong way, not the right way, in terms of having more workers to do it. And I do think that means employers across this country are going to have to be thinking differently about how to attract workers, retain workers, pay workers, and substitute for workers.
In regards to the strike, I'll just have a couple of comments. The first is that when we saw the pandemic supply chain disruptions that went on for quite some time, as time goes by, firms are going to find a way to get product in. And so you saw a migration of supply chains from the West Coast to the East Coast. So the way we're looking at this strike is that if it lasts for more than a week, the costs rise substantially at that point. They just keep on rising. And so you would see firms start to find new methods of coming in. And so I think I'd probably just leave it there. More than a week, very bad. More time, firms adapt.
I'll also say I've talked to a bunch of firms. I think there was a lot of pre-ordering going on with this strike. There were a lot of people who filled their, you should not expect much, if any, impact on Christmas shopping because a lot of people already have that stuff on site. And I even talked to some folks who are in the spring season, the home improvement type folks, and they already did some pre-ordering too. And as you said, people have already practiced moving from west to east. They can move from east to west. But there is an issue. The longer it goes, the more you'll see substantial reconfiguration.
You can't, with automation, the thing that I keep thinking about is you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? And so it's happening really fast. And the thing that worries me, to be honest, is the vicious cycle that is higher wages potentially push firms to move towards automation even faster, right? And so it's, I don't think it's an isolated incident. I think that the pressure is going to increase. Maybe history here is helpful in that technology for most of history has actually been a complement to workers in that, yes, it's destroyed some jobs, but it's created more jobs than it has destroyed. Now, of course, if you're in an industry, as Tom said, that is being decimated, that's not any comfort. But I think that if I were to make a forecast, I would say that this is not the last strike, this is not the last tension, and I don't know the best way to do it. The thing that is obviously concerned is that it's moving up the economic ladder, which means more of us are noticing automation implementation, and it's raising alarm bells for a lot of constituencies that had been sheltered from automation. But I don't know what the best way is to implement it if you're a company.
Our next question's from Britt at table 45.
Hi. My question was in regard to geopolitical risk. Is there concern of the ultra-right regimes gaining more steam and how that shift in ideologies could impact Europe's contribution as an economic leader, and then would those have impacts on our economy in the United States?
That's a complicated question.
And a really good one for you to answer.
Yeah, it's a great one to figure out.
Let me lean in.
So, yes, I mean, obviously that is a concern, but it's not just in Europe. We are seeing rising polarization across economies around the world, politically, not just in the region you mentioned, but also in South America, Central America. I mean, you could even say that the United States is in a similar position. I'm not a geopolitical scientist. I don't comment on that as being, as part of my job, but Eurasia Group does a lot of great work on that. They are a fantastic think tank, and they tend to believe that getting through this past election cycle without having a hard swing to the right was a really big accomplishment, or a large swing to the left was a really big accomplishment. The snap elections in Europe proved that out. There was no massive shock. It was almost like the government just became inept, or not inept, but unable to move forward some sort of any sort of policy that leaned one way or the other. So that was a pretty big move. And so we think that that would sort of be like a bellwether sign of how things are going so far.
One of my economists has a line I kind of liked. It's snarky, but he says, the U.S. doesn't import recessions, it exports them. And the point he's trying to make is, like China, we're the only two big countries in the world that basically don't depend on international trade for our health, right? We're 80+% of our GDP is stuff we manufacture or produce for ourselves and sell to ourselves. When you go to Europe, it's a very different answer. All these countries are heavily dependent on the rest of the world. So if we sneeze, they have a cold. If they sneeze, it doesn't really affect our economy much, unless you get into the financial panic kind of world, the Greece debt crisis of 10 years ago where, now you're hitting financial assets. But I think if it's just your normal everyday, their economy is struggling, we're just so big and so insulated next to them, it tends not to have a big impact on us.
And I'd like to circle back to something I mentioned about Germany. A huge exposure to Chinese demand. Flagging demand from China harms Germany. Germany has been the driver of Europe, harms Europe broadly. Germany has some really strict fiscal policies, so they don't have a lot of wiggle room to put forward stimulus to build that economy back up. But that weak economic growth coming from China has been an issue that's hitting different sectors in different countries around the world.
Oh, next question's from John at table 32.
For the panel, please, would appreciate some commentary on the impact of our substantial and growing national debt on the economy going forward.
Tom, would you like to tackle that one first?
Sure. You'd like me to comment on what the legislature does? I don't think I'm dying to do that. But I will give you some facts about the debt, which might be interesting. At the end of World War II, debt as a percent of GDP in this country was 106%. By 2007, a combination of some amount of prudence and a lot of growth by our forefathers had worked that down to 37%. Today, it's back over 100%. We're running almost $3 trillion deficits in a year where the economy is quite healthy. I think it's pretty straightforward to say trees don't grow to the sky. And at some point, our creditors will say, I don't really like that credit anymore. And no one can actually predict what the right number is. If we're at 102 today, is it 120 or 130? Japan's in the mid 200s, and they're still rolling along. Not that I aspire to the economy of Japan. But the way this hits you is at some point, and you could argue this would happen in the UK about a year and a half ago, at some point your long-term bondholders say, I don't really want that long-term bond at that yield, and long-term rates spike, and then you have the imperative to do something about it. But at this point, it's not, you asked the impact on the economy, obviously, all the stuff you learned in college would say, more fiscal spending is stimulative to the economy, and that's definitely part of it. It also creates some challenges. There's a lot of great infrastructure spending going on that actually is hiring a lot of construction workers, and so some developers who tell me construction costs aren't going down would say it's because we're competing for workers there. But on the other hand, you're also bringing jobs. You can make the case that in the short term, it has an effect, but the biggest thing I worry about is in the long term and what the effect will be someday on longer term interest rates.
So there are really two big factors that are helping the U.S. along the way. We have the world's reserve currency. So countries around the world love holding dollars. Investors around the world love holding dollars. And we have the world's safest asset in Treasury bonds. So for now, I wouldn't call it a Band-Aid, but it is what is so helpful about U.S. Treasury debt is that we do have those two things going for us. Most of the major credit rating agencies have marked down the credit quality of U.S. Treasuries. I think the last one was in 2023 or so, and part of that was due to some of the political dysfunction happening in Congress. But for this to crack and for the debt to become a really big issue that spreads across the economy, I would venture that it would take a stress event, unlike something we've seen in the past, to cause demand for the dollar and the Treasury as an asset to decline to a point where we can't fund our debt. Higher interest rates do cause a problem, so I don't want to leave that part out. I think in the last 3 years, interest as a percentage of interest paid on debt has grown 32, 38, and 34% or so year over year in each of those years, 22, 23, and 24. And so it is a growing concern, but at this point doesn't appear to have a crack that has any immediate issues.
Okay. Next question, if you're willing. So interest rates were at a decades high level, okay, so for a long period of time, 40 years. And so, and yet the economy's still been very robust during this time. So what did policymakers do right during this time frame? I mean, obviously something, I mean, yes, we're not willing to declare absolute victory yet, but really some things went very well. So President Barkin, we'll let you tackle this one.
Yes, you want me to talk about all the things we did right? Great, I've got some time for that. No, well, just for the facts, we started raising rates in March of 22. We reached the current rate of 5.3%, or the rate 2 weeks ago of 5.3% in July of 23. So they only were at 5.3% for 14 months. So you said 4 years, it wasn't quite that long. And just as context, trivia question, when's the last time, rates were at that level? And the answer is it's 04, 05. And for those of you who were in housing or even remember the economy in 04, 05, it wasn't a bad economy. So we sort of think of 5% as this huge, increase in rates, and it was a big increase from 0. But 5 on the history of the U.S. is just not a very high rate level. And somebody here is going to say, yeah, I bought my first house and the mortgage rates were 18% and mine too. So, the economy can survive that. I just say that. It was also easier to survive that, I'd say, because a lot of people locked in low rates when they were low. So a lot of people refinanced their mortgages. I think the median mortgage in this country is in the 4s, right? So there's 92% of the mortgages are fixed these days. It was 70-30 variable in 2008. And so people had mortgages, they didn't feel the big increase. You might have had credit card debt, and that was an issue, but there was all this stimulus, and so there was still excess savings being worked down, so the level of debt wasn't as high, and so that didn't hit it. A lot of companies refinanced their debt or paid down their debt, and so the total interest burden in this country 3 months ago was no higher than it was in 2009, even though rates were higher. So you had less impact. The third thing that really helped is inflation expectations, and this is kind of a nerdy concept that the economists think about, but do people really expect inflation to come back to normal or not? If they don't, then the Fed's got to do a lot more work for a lot longer. If they do, then just doing what we're supposed to do will get inflation down, which allows us to bring rates down. And you could argue that's what's happening now. So less impact of rates directly and less duration of inflation than you might have remembered from the episodes in the 70s. And I think that's why you didn't see that much impact in an economy that I'll just say is impressively vibrant, the U.S. economy. I think Ben actually mentioned it earlier, but if you run around the world and you say, what does inflation look like and what does growth look like? In the developed countries, we're the standout. A lot of people had inflation come down, but we're the one set of folks who've been able to do that with growth continuing to be strong. And I think that's just a statement about how strong this country is.
Anyone else? And I do want to give credit to Elizabeth Redenbaugh. Where are you, Elizabeth? That I amended her question a little bit and presented it. Thank you for that. Dr. Guettabi.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Guettabi, so we talked a little bit about the tragedy in the western part of the state. So are there going to be what kind of impact should we anticipate in our state and beyond as we move forward, and especially for our region?
Yeah, I mean, obviously our hearts are with the people of Western North Carolina, but pivoting to the economic impact, it's, there are 28, 29 counties, depending on how you count, that are part of the affected region, and they represent, the North Carolina Department of Commerce added up the number of people living in those counties, and it's north of 1.7 million. It's about 14% of the state's economy. And I did some back of the envelope calculations, and that region represents about 16% of the state's GDP. And so obviously that means a lot of jobs, a lot of businesses. And now the rebuilding becomes really challenging, and we know, how much tourism takes place in that region. And so, it's absolutely devastating. Obviously, the human toll is what we care about right now, but the economic toll is going to be very significant, and there are going to be some big questions about how quickly those regions are able to rebuild, and to what extent they look like they did before. But 15% of a state's GDP is nothing to sneeze at, obviously.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Thanks for being with you. Thanks for your work. Great seeing
And
you
I'm going to
today.
turn it back over to Rob Kaiser.
Well, thank you again to Dean Burris and the partnership with UNCW. The expo hall is now open just down the hall here, and the seminars will restart at 2 o'clock, just further down on the Nut Street side. Thanks again for being a part of BIZ Expo.